What's going on, guys? So today we're doing the first installment of a short series where I'm sitting down with Paul Oneid, and we're going to be deconstructing the squat, bench, and deadlift. Now, today we're going to be covering the squat, and I'm really excited because one, Paul is a really, really phenomenal squatter, and so he's got a lot of great advice for how to improve the squat. I've been working with you for about a month now, and I've actually
Yep.
noticed a massive difference in just like how my squat feels and some pretty awesome progression. So I'm really excited to get you on and just kind of hear what you have to say. So first off, thanks for jumping on. Paul, could you I know you've been on the podcast before, but maybe for people who haven't heard of you before, could you give a brief introduction?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Paul Oneid. I am a competitive powerlifter in the 220, 242 class. I've squatted over 800, probably 11 times now. My best squat's 850 in the gym, 805 in a meet, best bench 430, and best deadlift 727. Best total is 1960. I am the co-coach over at Coach's Corner University with Tony Montgomery. I also own a coaching business myself, doing training and nutrition called Master Athletic Performance. I've been coaching for over 15 years and have about 7 years experience as a collegiate strength and conditioning coach, which is where I started. Then I transitioned into disability rehabilitation and now coaching exclusively online.
Awesome. All right, so I wanted to set the stage for this conversation just by kind of covering a couple of basics. So, just so everyone's kind of on the same page, do you want to give a quick rundown of sort of deconstructing the squat execution and to kind of anchor the rest of the conversation? So, we'll kind of start by covering like unracking and finding your stance, breathing and bracing, and then also the eccentric and concentric phases of the lifts.
For sure, for sure. So, I do want to say first, like the biggest piece of advice I have for any squatter when it pertains to the execution of the squat is that you want the movement to be I use the word quiet because you want there to be as little wasted movement as possible. So how you set the squat up and execute it needs to be geared towards keeping it as quiet as possible, as efficient as possible. So when we set the hands, we want to make sure that it's a comfortable distance from one another and you're centered on the barbell. Where you place the bar is going to be dependent a lot on the comfort level of the lifter. But for the sake of generality, we're going to assume it's a lower bar position, so below the top surface of the traps, all the way down onto the rear delts. From there, you're going to set your feet a little narrower than shoulder width apart, assuming you're walking out the bar. From there, you'll take your deep breath into your belly, stand up the bar, pulling the head up nice and tall and the lats down. You'll hold that head tall lats down position as you step back. When you step back from the bar, you're going to want to try and make it as least steps as possible. So the reason we start narrow and then step wide is if you started with your feet wide and then backed up, you would have to rotate your torso, which would get the bar moving to a large degree. So we start narrow. Our first step back is a step out. Then the next step is out. Ideally, this is your squat position. If not, you can take a third step and adjust your feet. From there, you're going to exhale slightly to reset your brace. I like to use what I call a package deal brace. So as you inhale through the nose, the reason we use a nasal breath is to increase activation of the diaphragm and pelvic floor. So the top and bottom of that abdominal cavity. We're going to breathe in through the nose. As we're breathing in, we're going to be pulling our head tall. So the crown of our head to the ceiling, like a puppet on a string, the chin back, the elbows down to engage the lats. We're also going to be rooting ourselves into the floor. So digging that big toe into the ground, splaying our feet and screwing our feet into the floor. We're going to squeeze the glutes and quads. So all of that is happening as you're breathing in through the nose. Once you've taken your breath, you're going to brace out 360 degrees into your belt. The rib cage and pelvis will be perfectly stacked on top of one another. To initiate the squat, you're going to hinge at the hips to begin the movement. A common misconception here is that you want to be as vertical as possible and drop straight down, meaning you start from the knees. The reason we load the glutes first through a hip hinge is because you want to load the muscles from largest to smallest, and you want to make sure that the muscles loaded first are the ones that are loaded most. So we hinge into our strong glutes and hamstrings, and from there we sit straight down. So that's the old back, back, back. That's not what we do in raw squatting. We load the hips and then we sit straight down. As we sit down, the load is transferred more into the quads, but that eccentric is controlled by the glutes and hamstrings, which enable the knees to track appropriately over the feet. As we hit the bottom, we're going to explosively drive again the head back and head tall. So chin back, head tall, pushing into the barbell, resisting that vertical or that horizontal push forward. And we're trying to keep that bar path over the middle of our foot. Once we do that, we lock out with the hips and we stand up. So that was I'm sure we can get into the nuances of each sequence there, but that's a brief overview of how I would look at a squat and coach it from top to bottom.
We can definitely go into some of those positions a little bit more. I guess before we do that, though, can you just kind of go over the relative contributions, like the muscular contributions of the squat? Because there still seems to be a little bit of confusion around what the primary movers are and how each functions within the squat.
So the way I look at the squat and most, like almost every movement, is you want to load the eccentric in the opposite fashion that you would engage in the concentric, right? So in a concentric of a squat, we're driving knee extension and then hip extension. So knee extension to drive to straighten the leg, and then hip extension to bring the hips back underneath the bar. Well, in the eccentric, we want to load the glutes and hamstrings with a hip flexion, so a hinge. And then we want to go into knee flexion as we sit into the bottom of the squat, and then knee extension and hip extension. So in terms of contribution of the musculature of the lower body, that hip extension and eccentric control of hip flexion is going to come from the glutes and hamstrings. Knee extension is going to come from the quads. You're going to have a relative contribution of the calves depending on how much forward knee travel you have. And then the adductors will also be responsible for pelvic control and hip extension. So the squat from a lower body standpoint is really a coordinated contribution from posterior chain to anterior chain. When we get into the upper body contribution of the squat, I come back to the word quiet. The upper body should be isometrically contracted throughout. It should be as rigid as possible, and we should not see any movement through any muscles or anything in a perfect squat. Once that head position is set, the elbows are pulled down and the brace is set, that upper body's set in stone. It doesn't move. So those lats as we know, the lats engage to the thoracolumbar fascia. They integrate with the glute med on the opposite side to control that pelvis laterally from the posterior. The obliques are going to engage with the adductor on the opposite side for the anterior oblique sling to control the pelvis from the anterior. And then the rectus is going to prevent any type of collapse through the midsection. The midsection becomes important because that's where we transfer force. So any loss of tension through the midsection is going to be a power leakage. Anytime we have a power leakage, we're going to have to search for tension somewhere in the body where it doesn't belong. And we lose that semblance of a quiet squat. I think that's good.
Awesome. And so when you start out working with a new lifter, what are the key elements that you're screening for? Like I send you a squat video and say, this is what my squat currently looks like. What are some of the key things that you're looking for in evaluating someone's squat?
So before I even look at their squat, a lot of times lifters will come to me and they've got like nagging issues. So, I mean, you came to me, at the risk of, client-patient confidentiality.
Yeah, go for it.
You came to me with a chronic rib issue. So you had that almost like a thoracic outlet type situation, which would indicate some form of power leakage through the midsection, an inability to engage the lats, keep that spine neutral. Then you sometimes clients will have knee injuries or back injuries or hip injuries or chronic pain there. So I've already in my mind kind of got an idea where those breakdowns are going to come from, right? So if they've got chronic knee pain, likely there's an internal rotation at the hip issue or some type of issue at the foot. If they've got a back injury, likely there's a midsection instability. So just like in my mind, I'm kind of already preparing myself for what I'm about to see. When I watch a squat, I watch for where am I seeing power leaks? Where am I seeing losses of tension? Where am I seeing tension recruited where it should be? An example, like I always look for, is this lifter maintaining a stacked position underneath the barbell? A stacked position underneath the barbell simply means that the bar stays over the midfoot, the hips are as close to that vertical plane, and they're maintaining an even foot pressure. So if they're squatting and they've got this forward head position, they're arched in the lumbar spine, their knees are collapsing, that's what I'm looking for. Are there areas where we are looking for tension, where tension should not be found? Or are we seeing loss of position due to some type of cueing issue? One thing that I have tried to get away from, and I think I've done quite a good job, is immediately jumping to the prescription of special exercises, which I know we'll get into, and looking at, does this lifter just need to learn how to squat better before we look at where, like, are these actual weaknesses or breakdowns, or is it simply that this person doesn't know how to leverage their body underneath a barbell? So that's what I look for first. Can this lifter orient themselves in an efficient manner under the bar? And now this is a kind of a cautionary tale to young coaches, but do not be tied to an arbitrary execution of a movement. So don't be tied to the fact that every lifter has to squat with an upright posture. Every lifter has to have their elbows directly underneath the barbell. They have to squat with some arbitrary stance width or some arbitrary foot external rotation. We look for themes. Notice I didn't say anything about how wide the feet were or how externally rotated. I just mentioned, are they efficiently stacked underneath the barbell? Right? Because the way a lifter feels most comfortable is usually where they're going to be the strongest. And as long as we are flexible in our application of certain principles, like we shouldn't see a large knee valgus. Like we shouldn't see the knees travel inside of the inside of the framework of the foot. But if there's a slight knee valgus and it stays on top of the feet, it's not that big of a deal. You know what I mean? Everyone's built differently, and that's what it comes down to. So having an understanding of the principles that you're trying to apply and being flexible in the application of, is this lifter actually weak? Is this lifter just not orienting themselves appropriately under the barbell? Or do we actually need to change their technique to get them into a more stable or comfortable posture to achieve the desired outcome?
Yeah, and that's a great point too. Because I mean, you look at two people that come to mind, I guess, in the women's division are Marissa Inda and Hunter Henderson. Where Hunter Henderson
polar opposites,
yeah, monstrously wide squat, like she's doing a sumo pull almost, and then Marissa Inda is basically like her
heels
feet are
touching.
almost touching. Yeah. And they both have, are like world record holders. So I find it hard to say that either one of them is doing anything wrong.
Yeah, and they both have that low bar position. I mean, Hunter looks like she's squatting in a Smith machine most times, which is why she's so successful right in that movement.
She's like the female Yuri Belkin.
Yeah, and like Yuri Belkin is another great example. Okay, so take Yuri Belkin and Dan Green. Okay, both pull sumo, both squat relatively wide. Yuri's feet on the squat are super externally rotated. He squats with a very low bar position, nice narrow hand, and he's very upright. Then you have a lifter like Dan Green, orients himself very similarly under the bar, a tight hand position, wide stance, but Dan's feet are a little less externally rotated, and he loads his hips a ton. So just two lifters that achieve world-class levels of performance, built a little bit differently, execute the squat a little bit differently, right? But they both execute the squat with a nice stacked posture. Their joints are on top of one another. They don't have any huge power leaks when they execute the movement. There's nothing to nitpick there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's kind of the point that gets lost in translation, where it's mostly if you're following the principles, how that execution looks can have a pretty significant variation from one person to the next, but they're all still hitting those major check boxes, right?
Exactly.
Whereas,
Yeah.
sometimes when you look at a lifter and they're like, this is how I do things, you kind of get caught up with specifically how their form looks versus what they're trying to accomplish with their form.
Yeah. And I mean, very seldom, I'll use myself as an example. So I squat very differently than I did 5 years ago. Reason being is I literally can't squat the same way I did 5 years ago. But the way I did 5 years ago was very, very comfortable for me. I had a moderately wide stance, feet externally rotated quite a bit, super, super, super upright. Well, I've had knee surgery since then. I've torn my quad. I've had hip flexor issues. I have to load my glutes more. My bar position is lower. My feet are more narrow. I'm in a more hinged posture, right? I still stay very stacked. I still have, I wouldn't say world-class squatting ability, but I'm absolutely positive I can still squat over 800, right? But when I do it again, it's going to look completely different. I'm also wearing flat shoes. I used to wear a heeled shoe, right? So as long as we look for, as you said, I love that analogy of check boxes, right? We look for these, qualities within the movement, and as long as those are present, we're happy, right? We can build on that.
And so, if someone does have, let's say, a handful of energy leakages, like you were mentioning, how do you decide which area is going to have the greatest contribution to improving their squat? Because sometimes you'll fix one thing, and then a lot of the downstream effects are kind of corrected on their own. Sometimes you might work on one thing, and it's not necessarily the issue. So, how do you kind of decide where you're going to start?
Um, I like the word downstream. So in the squat, because I'd say that the squat and the deadlift are very similar, but in those two movements, you're connected to the floor, but the barbell is attached to the body at the shoulder. So you have to determine, is the energy leakage coming from where the bar is attached to the shoulder, or how that force is being pushed into the floor? So is it a downstream problem or is it an upstream problem? So I would look at, starting from the top, I would kind of go through a checklist of like, okay, how's their head position? Okay, does the head position change in the bottom? How's their elbow position? How's their connection to the floor? Their rooting? Are they hinging? So are they sequencing the movement the way I want them to be? And that's kind of where I go through the checklist. Most times, unless you're dealing with a lifter who is a very high training age or who has achieved a world-class performance, the way they squat is going to be the way they squat. So you're going to have a really clear view of like, this isn't a sequencing issue or a code or a technique issue. It's an actual breakdown. So I'll usually have a lifter go through a few weeks of programming and see like, okay, can I get their technique a little bit better? Can I coach them through it before I look at, I'll give them, so for example, a first program I give somebody, and I know we're going to get into this, but kind of jumping ahead, is going to include a lot of loaded end range movements. So it's going to include like loaded end range hip flexion. So something like a deficit stiff leg deadlift or a Romanian deadlift, something where I'm putting them under load and hip flexion. Can they control the torso? Can they engage the lats? They're going to go into some sort of end range knee flexion, some type of split squat or front squat or something where the knee has to travel a great deal over the foot. Are they able to hit those positions? Like, we get a lot of our insight on the breakdowns in the main lift by how the lifter can perform the assistance lifts. So if you program the assistance lifts correctly, you always want to look at the competition lifts of the lifter. Like when we do intakes, like I took a look at your Instagram. I looked at how you squat. I looked at how you bench. I look at how you deadlift. And through that and what you're telling me in your questionnaire, I can look at, okay, where do I need to address the assistance work? Well, if a lifter comes to me with knee problems and on their squat, it looks okay, but their knee hurts, and then I look at their assistance work and they can't do a single leg RDL, I know we have to attack hip stability, right? So that's where I'm going to cue them more from that aspect on the competition movement. So not only are we looking at, does the execution of the competition movement contribute to the weakness or the power leakage? How are they performing on the assistance work? The assistance work that I've initially chosen to attack those areas of focus that I thought were there. And sometimes I'm completely wrong. And I think a lot of coaches, like, you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely this. And then you start attacking it. And it's like, well, you definitely don't have poor hip stability because you can single leg RDL 100-pound dumbbells, but your knee still hurts, right? So, okay, let's attack this from a different direction. So there's a bit of a roundabout way, but I would just kind of look at if the breakdown is coming from the upper body or the lower body. Is it coming from an inability to wedge under the bar with the upper body, or is it coming from an inability to root into the floor and maintain tension in the lower body? Or are we having a breakdown in the sequencing of the movement, or a breakdown during any portion of the movement? So an example there would be, yeah, the person is wedged in nicely under the bar, they hip hinge, but at the bottom they collapse, right? So looking at where those are going to be. And then from there, if we know that they're executing the movement the way we want them to, we're still seeing those breakdowns, and we're doing the assistance work to target those areas that we believe are the culprit, then we look at modification of that competition movement, or including different barbell variants or tempo changes and things like that. One thing I will say, is I try to maintain specificity as long as I can before I go to any type of variation. And specificity just means within that competition movement. So I try not to vary more than 2 or 3 variants from the competition movement. So a variant could be a change in bar position, it could be a change in tempo, or it could be a change in barbell, right? So once you go to high bar, 1 deviation, high bar pause, 2 deviations, high bar pause tempo, 3 deviations. If you get into stuff like cambered bar tempo squat to a box with chains, now you're at like 5 deviations from the competition movement, you're going to lose any type of dynamic, not any type, most of the dynamic correspondence. So if you can accomplish the goal with as close to a movement as the competition movement, you will be better off over time, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And I mean, even from a rehab standpoint, it makes sense. A lot of the, like, even just speaking with, I know you know Quinn
Yep.
from Clinical Athlete, and so he's a big advocate of the top down approach as well. Like, why regress more than you actually need to if the athlete can kind of tolerate either the
Well,
loading or the exercise or whatever it is. So
and from like the biopsychosocial model, as soon as you regress the athlete, that's a hit to the ego, right? It's a hit to the confidence, which is going to affect their perceived competence, which is going to affect their self-efficacy, which is going to affect their perception of pain, and so on and so forth. So you want, like, the research is very clear. Specificity works. So the more often we can competition squat a person, the more they're going to be able to competition squat. The problem is that competition squat does tend to be more fatigue inducing. So we look for variations to accomplish a similar goal with less fatigue. That doesn't mean that you have to get completely away from competition squatting.
yeah, yeah, it's definitely a fine line. Sometimes I think the whole idea of specificity and transference is somewhat like diluted, where you always are low bar squatting, you always are doing this, and it's like, I do think that you should be keeping, the competition movements are at least a very close derivative in pretty much at all times, but whether it makes up like the majority of your squatting versus maybe some ancillary movements or something like that, just to kind of keep the pattern going, or even
Yeah.
just to kind of keep familiar. Because I know, like, I have some athletes where if they don't do low bar squats all the time, it takes them like 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get back into the groove.
You kind of waste those 2 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like it's so pointless. And so I always try and kind of keep something going in there. So when it comes to some of the more general issues that you've seen with squatters and some of your athletes, even
Yeah.
myself, like what are the main things that you've noticed that are fairly common among athletes?
So head position and foot pressure often go hand in hand. So that would be the number one breakdown that I see is an inability to keep that chin retracted and head pulled to the ceiling. So like the concept of get as tall as you can. So if I was to get as tall as I can, I wouldn't stick my chin up. I wouldn't pull my head, but like pull my head back into my traps. I would retract my chin and then kind of pull it to the ceiling. As I do that, my spine gets longer. I go into thoracic extension, but I never lose the connection between my ribs and pelvis. So that cue of like a puppet on a string, having the top of your head pulled to the ceiling, keeping that throughout. Then any deviation of the head usually leads to a forward deviation of the barbell. So as soon as my chin goes forward or my head drops, that barbell goes forward, which is going to put me onto my toes more. Well, what happens when you get pushed onto your toes? You shoot your butt back, which you get into a really hinged over position. You don't leverage the quads out of the bottom of the squat. The bar path trends towards the toes. So coordinating the athlete in a fashion where they can keep that head tall, they can hinge the hips, but then maintain an even foot pressure on the arch of that foot, keeping it stable with the big toe down, keeping that bar path over the midfoot. That's the number one breakdown. Number two that I often see is a collapse through the midsection because it's never set to begin with. So the manifestation of that is going to be either like an excessive knee valgus or a stripper squat. Okay, so a stripper squat meaning that the hips shoot up before the shoulders rise. What I mean by that is when we set our brace, so I mentioned in the beginning that package deal bracing strategy where you pull the lats down, brace into the belt, and stack the ribs and pelvis. If you hinge and maintain that orientation, right? So you maintain the distance from your sternum to your dick, that will keep everything stacked. If the first initiation of the squat is to elongate that distance and arch into the squat as opposed to hinge, so we go into anterior pelvic tilt, number one, you're going to put more shear on the lumbar spine. Number two, you've essentially turned off, if you want to use that word, or deleveraged, lost tension through the glutes. So you've lost lateral hip stability. And then all of that hip stability comes down to the adductors. So what's going to recruit out of the bottom? The adductors. So the adductors are going to pull in and they're going to result in your hips shooting up because adductors equal hip extension. So you're going to extend the hip before the knee is fully extended, stripper squat. The way to fix that, it's not necessarily to make the athlete stronger. It's just to teach them how to use their strength, right? So how to orient under the barbell. So cueing that brace and a hinge as opposed to a brace and an anterior tilt. Something as simple as increasing the time under tension so that they can feel their positions. So tempo work is very effective in that regard. Or looking at, okay, the next breakdown for knee valgus is simply, are you trying to squat too wide for your frame? I cannot tell you the number of times I get athletes, especially females, trying to squat super wide. And I'm like, hey, let's move your feet 2 inches in on each side. Boom, no more knee valgus, right? We have to remember that the hips are shaped differently for every person. If you don't have the hip structure to squat wide, you're just not going to be able to squat wide with the appropriate positions that we're looking for. So I would say those three breakdowns are probably going to be the most common. Second to that would be a loss of upper body positioning. So maybe your head position is good, but the elbow is pointed back, so you're in relative thoracic flexion. That will always result in a forward forward bar travel in the bottom, especially, and an inability to keep the hips underneath the bar. Because if the bar is forward, you're not going to be able to leverage hamstrings, and then your body will shoot your hips back to try and find tension in the hamstrings and bring it forward. A very important concept when dealing with any lift is you want to find the positions of maximal tension. Jay Nira is one of my best friends, and he was my favorite lifter when I started powerlifting. He has a quote that we use in our seminars. He says, "Pay attention to the tension. The tension is your teacher." All of your strength lies in tension. So how do I put my body under the greatest amount of tension in the bottom position of the squat? That is the position in which I need to find every single repetition. So if we have power leaks and we lose tension, we're out of position.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. So I guess this is kind of a good time to talk about that then, because probably, yeah, the most, at least for myself anyways, one of the biggest issues that I see is, I think number two it was, right, where people initiate the lift by going into anterior pelvic tilt and just kind of dropping down. And that's a pretty hard thing to fix, sometimes anyways. So can
I
you
think
go
that's a
over?
reason. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I think
No,
that
no, go
that's a
ahead.
reason why people tend to avoid teaching a hip hinge. Like the trend now is like, no, break the knees first. That doesn't make any fucking sense, and it drives me nuts. Why would I break at the knees first? Just from a physics standpoint, if I break at the knees first, all I'm doing is dorsiflexion and hip flexion. Okay, so I'm sitting straight down. I'm gonna run out of room. Eventually, I'm either gonna run out of room or cut my squat high. Then, if I'm going to cut my squat high, I have to shift my hips back. So you get into this position where you sit straight down and then back. You're fucked. I never understood that. Just get your hips out of the way, hip hinge, get your hips out of the way, and then sit your ass between your heels. Done. Create space. Done. But anyway, sorry. Continue.
No, that is a good point, because that's something I see a lot of, especially, and I definitely have that as a bad habit for myself. And I think
Yeah,
it was just because when I was weightlifting, everything was just super
exactly.
heavy
Yeah,
going
for
down,
sure.
and
I was
everything
the
was high
same.
bar, everything was front squat. And then when I switched to low bar, I mean, I've always been self-coached, and so I'd kind of look at people and watch everything and be like, oh, that makes sense, and this and that. And then, like, I know what to do, but and I think I'm doing it, and then I watch myself and I'm like, oh, I'm not doing
No.
it.
It's hard, and that proprioception is something that a lot of people lack, and I think part of it is because not a lot of people do core work. Not a lot of people train their abdominals, and unless you train through a range of motion, you're going to have very little connection. Like, to use the bro term, like mind muscle connection, right? So if you have very poor connection with those areas of your body, you're not going to be able to recruit them under load. So one thing that I do a lot of the time is every warm up contains a core drill, and on lower body that's geared towards stabilizing core through hip movement, whether it's a dead bug, whether it's a bird dog, a Copenhagen plank, um, anything of the sort. I need proximal stability and distal mobility. So the ability to stack ribs and pelvis and then go through ranges of motion with the hip. Uh, that fault is hard to fix, especially when people get really fired up. So when, like, say the loads are high and your arousal needs to follow suit, the ability of the lifter to actually set that brace and keep it there needs to be automatic. So putting in contingencies like tempo work and things like that in the early stages of training, or even pause work for that matter, it kind of fixes the problem for itself. Like, if you try to pause a squat in anterior tilt, you won't be able to maintain tension into the bottom. You'll just dump into your knees. So if you dump into your knees, that's immediate feedback. Hey, I didn't brace properly. Right? So I am a big fan of prescribing assistance work that does the coaching for me through physical feedback. Right? A good example, that's a front squat. You want to improve someone's thoracic extension, get them to front squat heavy. Well, if you can't front squat heavy, guess what's going to happen? If you can't maintain thoracic extension, guess what happens? You lose the barbell and you break it. Easy fix. You're thoracically extended when you perform a front squat, right?
Yeah, no, I'm also a really big fan of choosing movements that, I mean, I guess you frame it a little nicer than me. I usually say exercises that punish a fault.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great analogy. Yes.
And yeah, I'm a big fan of like the zombie squats and stuff like that, because I find like with myself, I'm so freaking stiff. And like I used to be able to do a front rack position like no problem, but now when I do it, like I'll be squatting. Well, even the other day, you had me squatting a top set of 5 or something like that, and I was doing 400, and I did 4 reps, but then the bar kept slipping, and all I felt was my elbows. Like the weight was not heavy. All I felt was my elbows were about to explode, and then I had to dump the bar forward, and I was just like, yeah, I've
Okay.
got terrible mobility, terrible thoracic
Okay. I'm
extension.
gonna I'm gonna I'm gonna tell you something you might not know nothing about. You're 280 pounds and bench over 400. You have no business front racking a barbell. Cross your arms.
I guess I just won't squat like that ever again. But anyways, yeah, going back on to what we were talking about before about kind
Yeah.
of correcting that trunk position. So, can you go over like proper IEP and bracing? Because I think those two things are one. I think they're often conflated, and then I also think that a lot of the times people miss things. Like even just what you were saying about breathing through the nose to
Yeah.
get better like pelvic and diaphragmatic like stability and kind of co-contraction.
Yeah.
That's something a lot of people don't really know about. So can you kind of go into that and kind of give, well, actually,
Yeah.
that's good. That's
For
good.
sure. So um, the first piece is that most people, when they breathe and brace, they push their belly out. That's a conflation. So you do want to push out against the abdominals, right? Because you're trying to think about it as when you're breathing, like Chris Duffin is actually the one who I heard this analogy from. You want to think about bracing like you're filling a vase. So you nasally breathe. Again, we know that we create better diaphragmatic and pelvic floor co-contraction when we nasally breathe. We breathe in and we fill the air from the bottom up. Once it's full, what you're trying to do is you're trying to compress from the top and bottom and from the outsides in to push out, like to compress that air to a position where that belt is being pressured against 360 degrees. The easiest way to teach that, in my opinion, is to actually have a lifter squat with their belt 1 or 2 loops loose if they're using a prong belt, or if they're using a lever belt, to squat with the lever undone in their warm-up sets to actually force them to push out. So that's one. Number 2 is we need to make sure that the lifter has a good mind muscle connection with that musculature. And the only way to do that is to train it. So if you want to get better at recruiting the obliques, you need to get better at training the obliques. So simple things like side planks, Palloff presses, things like that to help you connect to that musculature is essential. But so when we talk about IAP just means, intra-abdominal pressure. So we are trying to put as much pressure through our abdominals as possible. But that can come at a detriment when we start to breathe into the chest and get into this like thoracic expansion. Because if you're squatting and you try to inflate your chest, you're going to lose connection with the abdominals. You're actually going to elongate the distance between the sternum and your pubic bone. I said dick earlier, it's your pubic bone. So having a balance between how much air you pull into that belly and where you're putting it. I think lastly is having an inability to move your limbs independent of your spine. So if you're braced and you're trying to go into hip flexion, well, let's practice some movements where we're braced and trying to go into hip flexion. Things like belt squat marches and things of that nature, like Zercher marches. have the athlete go through ranges of motion that teach them exactly what you want them to achieve in the competition movement. I think that covers it. Did I miss anything?
I just hope that everyone can understand some of the technical terminology you use, because not everyone's necessarily familiar what that means. The dick to the sternum. So just read a medical textbook. You guys will understand.
Yeah, your dick, it's like on the front of your body. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's hidden. Sometimes, you can find it.
So one thing as well that I'd just kind of like you to touch on is breathing, and whether or not that changes based on doing, like, let's say a heavy single or triple versus
Oh,
sixes or eights.
yeah. Okay. So this is a great conversation. And I'm going to start with a rant. If you walk out a squat and take your breath and I see the bar rise and then fall, you suck. You have no idea what you're doing. Number one, when you are walking out a squat, you should do so in a brace, right? So as you get under the bar, you set your shoulders, set your lats. You want to set your brace, okay? The reason being, as soon as that bar is loaded on your spine, you're compressed. You will never get as strong of a breath as you can when you're unloaded. So when I see people in a monolift, wedge underneath the bar, stand up, and then go, exhale, I'm like, you idiot. Because now all that weight is on your spine and you can't expand your core because it's already compressed. So when you're walking out, you're braced. And that next breath that you take is your small exhale, small inhale. You're not losing your brace. So that's for a single, right? So we want to keep the strongest brace we can. When you're squatting for multiple reps, you need to have a combination of what we call a respiratory bracing strategy and a muscular bracing strategy. So think about a sprinter who's running 400 meters. That sprinter must breathe while they're sprinting. So their bracing strategy cannot be centered on respiratory mechanisms. It cannot be achieved by breathing and holding the breath. They have to continue gas exchange. So bracing while performing multiple repetitions or extended exercise has to have a muscular component. So they're contracting their abdominals, their obliques, all of those things, but they're breathing through it. When you're squatting under load for multiple repetitions, you are able to breathe and use a respiratory strategy. So we breathe in and we compress the air. We use that air to increase intra-abdominal pressure, stabilize the spine. As you fatigue, your ability to use that respiratory strategy diminishes. What you can do is perform a set number of reps on a single breath and then rebreathe after a couple breaths. This is a more advanced strategy. What I do like people to do is to perform that first repetition with a fully respiratory strategy and then maintain that muscular contraction into the second, third, fourth, fifth while using less of a respiratory strategy. So I don't actually coach it this way, but it's just what I'm looking for. Like if I said that to a beginner athlete, they'd have no idea what I was talking about. All I'm looking for is this lifter collapsing and then reinflating between reps? Or are they maintaining their position under the bar between reps? If they're maintaining their position, I know that their abs are still working and they're still breathing into them, but they're still maintaining contraction. If you see that collapse under the barbell and then a reinflation, you know that they're not bracing properly and you can coach them accordingly. But understanding the difference between like a respiratory strategy, which would be for a single, and then a combination respiratory muscular, which can be used for multiple repetitions.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think you did a great job of kind of breaking down the difference, because that's one thing that honestly drives me nuts as well, is the people will get all tight, they unrack it, they come back and they go, and then you just see the bar like pop like 4 inches up, and you're like, dude, you've completely lost all the kinetic energy you just built up. Like, what are you doing?
Well, not only that. So if you look at like, okay, if you were to shrug up and come down, well, you're going through scapular elevation and depression. You are potentially losing a connection with the lats. Um, More than likely, you're putting the air in your chest as opposed to your belly, right? You want to compress the torso. If I'm breathing in through my chest, elevating my ribs against a loaded barbell and then sinking it down, number one, I'm probably making my torso longer. So I'm increasing the lever arm between my hip and the barbell. If anything, if you ever see me squatting a heavy single with a straight bar, I walk the bar out, I breathe into my belly, the bar doesn't move up, it sinks down, right? It sinks down as I brace. I'm shortening that lever arm, and it might be only a half an inch, but that makes a huge difference when that's 750, 800 pounds. Right? An inch becomes a mile, especially as the loads increase. So if we can leverage even the littlest bit, we must do it. And then it also ensures that the air goes to the right spot.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that like when I started changing up my breathing and really feeling, actually, you know what? It's funny because for me, anyways, I found that my bracing improved the more that I focused on my balance through the feet and the load distribution through my feet. So when I
Okay.
focused on that, it just kind of like the rest of me just kind of sort of aligned naturally in order to make my balance evenly distributed. And then,
So it's that upstream or downstream, right? So your
yeah,
issues were
yeah.
upstream coming from the bottom. Some people have that same issue, but focusing on their head position and lat tension fixes that issue. It's tough. It's tough to know.
Yeah, but it was so crazy, like how all those things were related. And then once I started doing that, that was kind of when I started realizing that I had this like big anterior pelvic tilt, and I was like, oh, this is kind of causing some issues. And then same thing, like started kind of really focusing on just breathing in, and like as you're breathing in, you just kind of feel yourself sinking into the ground a little
Yeah.
bit more. I don't know, like it's almost like the way I kind of described to some people is sometimes when you lift the bar and you unrack it, you're like trying to hold the bar up versus like just letting it sink in and like feeling the load through your feet as opposed to feeling it up on your shoulders like you're trying to carry something.
Yeah.
And and when I started bracing a little differently and really expanding through the belt, that's when I noticed a big difference. And it was like, oh, it doesn't feel like it's really heavy on my back anymore. Like it does, but it's different.
Yeah.
You feel more connected.
The one thing that people, so with your specific issue with the thoracic flexion issue, if you go into anterior pelvic tilt, you're increasing that moment arm. So you're going to have more forward translation of the barbell, which is going to naturally put you into more thoracic flexion. So there's always there's compensations above and below, right? So if you APT, anterior pelvic tilt, and you lose connection laterally through the pelvis and you end up collapsing at the knees, well, that's a fault too. But that force could also go upstream, right? That loss of tension could also go upstream. So the lats are internal rotators of the shoulder. If you tension the lats and then flex the T-spine, maybe that was a more stable position for you. But as soon as you correct that anterior pelvic tilt, you free up some degrees of freedom through the thoracic spine. You're able to get into a more extended posture. Well, now you don't have that compression problem, right? So it could be both sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I don't doubt that I have a whole host of problems that are
You're
unresolved.
not that bad. You're way too hard on yourself. You're really not that bad.
All right. Um, so let's move into some of the actual considerations regarding like, well, I know you touched on exercise selection a little bit there, um, but maybe if we could talk about like frequency, loading, um, and
Sure.
then you did touch on assistance movements as well and some variation stuff. But
So let's go down the list. So in terms of frequency, it's important to know what you stand to increase when you, or what you stand to manipulate when you look at a variable. So when it comes to frequency, the benefit to frequency is motor learning, right? More frequent exposures to a movement are going to develop better patterning, assuming that you're performing the movement with proficiency, are going to develop a more consistent pattern and you're going to be able to, the more exposures you get, the better you're going to be able to leverage that skill. Well, frequency also brings with it the fact that you have to recover from every exposure. So if your loads are excessive, right? So if your loads are high intensity, whether absolute or relative, you will be able to tolerate less frequency. So someone who's squatting 4 times a week, their average intensity will have to be lower than somebody who's squatting twice a week, because they could not tolerate the same average intensity as someone who only got 2 exposures. So there's always going to be trade-offs when manipulating variables. What we might see is that as we get closer to a meet, the frequency of specific work should go up, right? Because as we're getting closer to a meet, there is more consideration to technique and output. Well, when we look at volume, again, the more volume you can tolerate, the more adaptation you potentially can accrue. But volume must be recovered from. In recovery, you have to look at your recovery like a budget. So you have a certain amount of adaptive energy that you can allocate for recovery. And every time you manipulate a variable, you either end up leaving more money in the bank or taking out more withdrawals. Volume seems to be something that demands a lot of money. Okay, so if you're squatting with a lot of volume, you're going to be able to tolerate less frequency and typically less intensity. This can be confounding because if you spread the volume over more days, you have the potential to tolerate more overall volume if it's split between more days than if it was split between less days. But again, it's going to be dependent on the average intensity of those sessions. So when you look at frequency, intensity, and volume, intensity, I refer to the absolute intensity, so the load on the barbell, they all work together. It's a cycle, right? They cannot exist in a bubble. So what you'll see sometimes is people who are inexperienced at programming will have, like, say, a 3-time-a-week program, but then all 3 days of those exposures gets heavier at the same time, and then they end up getting fucked up. So you always have to have the ability to recover from whatever manipulation of the variables that you're putting forth. And that comes with communication, monitoring output, and looking at performance, right? So if performance is going up and frequency is high and your intensities are coming up and your volumes are relatively stable, well, you're in a good spot. But if intensity comes up, you're going to have to look at, okay, do I need to drop volume? Do I need to split this volume over more days? Do I need to condense the volume into less days? How am I going to manipulate it? And that's going to be based on the lifter's size, their experience, their gender, how relatively strong they are, how absolutely strong they are, a whole number of factors. And there's going to be outliers to everything. I think of a guy like John Hack, who's a world record holding powerlifter. He's very absolutely strong. He is incredibly relatively strong. He still tolerates high frequencies, right? Whereas you look at a guy like Dan Bell, who is the strongest person on the planet, he squats once every 2 weeks, right? So it's going to be very dependent on the individual, but as long as you understand how each variable impacts your training paradigm and that, stimulus adaptation response curve, you will be able to manage the exercise variations, intensities, volumes quite well for that lifter.
And so when it comes to like exercise selection,
Yep.
how do you determine like which exercises are going to have the highest transference, especially when it comes to accessories? Because sometimes I see people choosing exercises that are good exercises, but they're not necessarily appropriate for that particular lifter. Like, I don't know, Bulgarian split squats, I kind of feel like those are pretty damn good for like the vast majority of people. So maybe that's not the best example, but you know what I mean, right? Like,
okay, so it's like let's take a single leg RDL. Bulgarian would work too, but so a single leg RDL. Single leg RDL is a tremendous exercise to improve hip stability, to train the hamstrings and glutes, to practice bracing. It's essentially a loaded bird dog when you look at it. Someone like if you have a lifter who collapses through the knees, and then you see in their program that it's an ipsilateral single arm loaded single leg RDL, why would you train the adductors on a lifter who recruits their adductors more? Right? So that's where you get into the questions of like, why is this here? Well, for that lifter who has a chronic knee valgus, we might want to do a contralaterally loaded single leg RDL to leverage glute med a little bit better. So we train opposite the movement fault to get better stability through the hip in that manner. You're going to see carryover. One thing that I really harp on the young coaches is if you can't answer the question why to what exercise, modality, sets, and rep scheme of what you're doing, it shouldn't be in there. Right? If you can't tell me why you're doing a barbell row instead of a pendlay row, or why you're doing an ipsilateral load versus a contralateral load, or why you're using a med ball versus a dumbbell, or any of these instances, it has no business being in the program. I don't care if it's the fucking first movement of the day. You have to be able to answer why. When I look at the squat, let's talk in generalities, right? So my favorite assistance lifts for the squat are going to be the front squat, first and foremost. And then are going to be probably the high bar squat would be second. And then if we get into specialty barbells, it's usually going to be the safety bar. My favorite modification to the lift to actually, get a lot of carryover is going to be paused squatting, followed closely by tempo pause squatting. I'm not a big fan of tempoing without a pause. I don't really like, unless you're going for hypertrophy, I don't really see a big point. I'd rather you pause. The other thing that we need to look at is modifying movements and including movement variance is a tremendous way to control for absolute intensity. So say we are squatting 3 times a week. Well, if 2 of those squats are competition squats and 1 is a variant, we're more than likely going to be able to tolerate more volume. If 2 are a variant, we're probably going to be able to tolerate more volume because the average intensity from an absolute perspective is lower. So it's all about looking at how can I manipulate these variables to get more out of the athlete, knowing that over time I have to go from general to specific, right? So in the off season, if you're using multiple variations, you're going to be able to perform more volume and you're going to be able to work harder while accumulating less fatigue because the absolute intensities are lower. Because typically as you vary the movement from the competition movement, it becomes less and less absolutely intensive. So it's a tremendous tool to be able to understand these variables and manipulate them based on what you're kind of looking for within that instance, knowing very well that we need to get more specific as the competition approaches.
As far as aerobic conditioning and powerlifting, I know powerlifters are pretty, there's like all the memes going around, like 3 reps is cardio or whatever. But I have coached individuals who have just horrendous work capacity, and it took a while for them to actually get up to a certain level of fitness so they could actually train properly because they couldn't even handle enough stimulus to actually get them stronger at that point. And it was really bad. Granted, that's fairly rare, but I have had that. And this guy in particular was a really strong dude. So he's a young guy. He's like 22, 23, squats like 750 raw.
Oof.
So he's a big boy. He's like 135 kilos or something like that. But his general fitness was absolute dog shit. And so he'd do like 1 squat set, and then he'd be like, "I'm done for like the week," basically.
I have a lifter like that too.
And it took about like 6 to 8 weeks before he was able to like do a reasonable training session, and then could kind of finish his week, and it wasn't too bad for him. But what role does aerobic conditioning play in powerlifting, and how do you, or like what are the different modalities or executions that you like to implement to get their level of general fitness up?
So one thing that I found really interesting is I don't think you're going to be able to find this in the literature anywhere, which is unfortunate. It'd be a really cool study to run, is that my lifters who are the most aerobically fit peak the best. I don't have to lift them as heavy, and they get the best results in terms of training weights versus competition without fail. What role does aerobic conditioning have in powerlifting? I would say minimal. I do conditioning work myself because I enjoy it. I don't necessarily look at it as a way to improve my performance under the barbell. I think for the most part, you can get an athlete very fit by monitoring their non-exercise physical activity. So like how many steps they take a day, and by modifying their rest periods during certain portions of their off season. So if you're prescribing a good amount of work with reduced rest periods and supersets in their assistance work, you should have a fit athlete. It might take them a few weeks to get up there, but over time they will get more fit. Something as simple as making sure the athlete is getting 10,000 steps a day, they're going to be getting more work. They're going to be getting very low, like zone 1 aerobic capacity. If they're really bad, you might need to program some light conditioning, maybe some zone 2 stuff. So like somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to 140 beats per minute. It doesn't have to be crazy hard, and it doesn't have to be a lot. It could just be like 2 or 3 times a week for 20 minutes. Something that most people feel or don't understand is that aerobic fitness comes very quickly. Like to get a good base of aerobic fitness doesn't take more than a couple of weeks and a couple of exposures. So my main modality is walking. If it needs to be more than that, I might go to like an uphill walk or a treadmill walk. I do on occasion prescribe like sled drags and things of that nature. And I'm a really big fan of suitcase walks. So this is something that I got from a friend of mine, Cole Streets, who's a chiropractor in St. Myers, Florida. He would just grab a kettlebell and go for a walk. And every time he felt tired, he would switch positions. So it'd be like left hand, right hand, front rack, goblet carry, right hand, left hand, whatever. So he would just go for a 30-minute walk carrying a kettlebell. So he's getting a ton of core work and he's getting his aerobic capacity up. It probably increases the difficulty of the walk about 10% in terms of your heart rate. So it's a tremendous tool, or just going for a walk with a weighted vest or anything like that. The biggest piece of advice I have for lifters who want to include aerobic conditioning into their program is if you can save it at all, make sure that it is the least demanding in terms of recovery. If you get into doing metcons and sprints and hill sprints and tons of kettlebell swings and all this stuff, that becomes a training stimulus, which becomes a stressor, which is something that you need to recover from. Right. So remember, I mentioned that adaptive reserve, the bank account of recovery. Your aerobic work should put more money into your account than it should take out. That's a good rule of thumb.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely have had, actually recently I had a new client come to me, and they were telling me like about all the training they were doing, and they would do like 5 hard strength training sessions a week, plus 4 CrossFit sessions, plus they'd like ride.
Do you have a job?
I didn't ask. I was a little preoccupied just taking all these notes. I was like, oh my God, man. And and then on top of that, they do like 100 miles a week on their bike or something like that. It was just, it was absolutely ridiculous. And they're like, yeah, can we include like some HIIT training into this? And I was like, I think you might die.
Yeah.
I was just like, I think you need to cut something out, because you're not going to get any stronger if you're doing all of that stuff. Like, you need to kind of pick something.
Was the person really small?
They were very small. They were small and they were old. They had a ridiculous capacity though, because they were
oh shit, put 100 miles on his bike a week.
Yeah. They were like a former like professional racer or something like that. Like,
oh, cool.
It was like a bike racer or something like that.
But he wanted to get into powerlifting. That's a cool client to have.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
probably a shit bench press.
Probably, yeah. Well, I mean, he's an older guy anyways, right? He just kind of wants to get strong and stay healthy, But yeah, I was just like looking at what he was giving me. I was just like, this is at the same time you're doing all this stuff. I was like, Jesus, man, it's crazy. But yeah, I feel like HIIT training is like often taken out of context, where it's like, if you're doing 3 HIIT workouts per week, like that's your training.
I mean, it depends how long they are too. Like if you're just doing 10 minutes of sprints, like 10 EMOM sprints 3 times a week, it's probably not going to be very taxing. But if that becomes
yourself, man.
Well, sprint is relative, right? So I mean, if you're doing like 20-minute hit sessions 5 times, like again, frequency, intensity, duration, all is going to factor into how much you pull out of that bank account. And it's very easy to know when you're overdoing it, right? Because you'll see a dip in performance. Like I've been on my bike quite a bit lately, and I did the fucking worst deadlift session ever. I'm like, I wonder if there's a carryover. Well, of course there's a carryover.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, I'm definitely looking to get out a lot more. I used to do a lot of hiking, and then once I got beyond like 245, it became a little too hard to do these like 10, 12-hour hikes. And so, but I still want to get out longboarding and cycling and things like that, because that is a lot of fun.
Cycling's been really nice, actually. The only thing I've had trouble adjusting to is the posture, like that, like splayed out deep hip flexion posture.
Yeah.
The first couple of rides did beat up my SIs a little bit, but man, I fucking love it. I feel so energized afterwards. It doesn't really beat me up. My knees actually feel really good, which is nice. And I'm looking to get back into some mountain biking. There's some nice trails out here. So I took up mountain biking last year. So I moved away from Calgary and took up mountain biking. And then I got a road bike this year. So I'm looking to spend quite a bit of time on my bikes.
That's awesome. Yeah, the one thing that does get me though at this body weight is the seat. I just can't adjust to that thing.
A good pair of shorts.
I guess, yeah.
Oh, dude, if I didn't have shorts, my seats would. I'd have no more boners ever.
Basically. All right, so we'll kind of wrap things up here real quick. How do you decide what priorities to focus on within a given mesocycle?
Well, number one would be proximity from a meet. So how far are we away from a competition? Next is, because I use more of a concurrent model, I look at training like as a pie chart. So if we're far away and we can get very general with the training, more is going to be dedicated to hypertrophy, work capacity, that sort of thing, and less is going to be towards maximal strength. If we're looking at, as we get closer to the meet, our priorities are going to shift and the elements of that pie chart are going to kind of change in terms of their bias. But we're always doing a little bit of everything. And that can be extrapolated on, if you look at like hypertrophy, strength, power, putting that into a pie chart, then you look at like, okay, how much of my training is going to be looked at intensity, volume, duration, time under tension, all those different qualities. Well, that goes in a pie chart as well. Then you look at, okay, am I going to be doing internally stabilized or externally stabilized movements? Am I going to, all of these factors get thrown into pie charts, and we look at, okay, where are the needs of this individual? Well, if they want to get bigger and we're in the off season, well, we're going to be doing more externally stabilized movements, higher volumes, lower absolute intensities, higher relative percentages, or higher relative fatigue, and then looking at, okay, more sets to failure. All of these things will come together because we're trying to get bigger and put on more tissue. Then that's going to flow. So as long as you have a plan of like where the emphasis needs to be, because you know where the meat's going to be, right? Maximal intensity, maximal output, internal stabilization, no hypertrophy, no volume, high intensity. That's your endpoint. So how far away from that can we get? Then how can we look at each individual element and manipulate it in a way to get the best for that athlete? That comes from communication. Like, where does this athlete feel that they need the work? Where do you feel that this athlete needs the work? And then finding some type of common ground of like, okay, this is the approach that we're going to take. And then collecting data along the way, communicating thoroughly with them, knowing like, is this working for you? Am I seeing the outcomes that I want to see? And then over time, that plan iterates on itself until it gets to the point where you're at the meet.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we covered pretty much everything. And I feel like this is a really, really great kind of squat tutorial or squat manual. It was actually pretty interesting. I definitely learned a couple new things. So that was awesome. So we're kind of past that. Oh, I think we're actually coming up almost on 90 minutes right now. I think we're trying to do all. I think it was a little ambitious. You're going to do all
I
three
think
in
so
one
too.
day.
Yeah.
I honestly thought I was like, yeah, I think we can knock these out in like 30 minutes each, hour and a half. That should be fine. And then I'm like, oh yeah,
We're
not
getting
even
the
close.
weeds, man.
Yeah, exactly. But do you want to just tell the listeners where they can find you?
Absolutely. So on Instagram, you can find me at Paul Oneid, Pauloneid, at Coach's Corner U, at Master Athletic. And then my website is masterathletic.com. And then for Coach's Corner, we're actually running a 14-day free trial right now. So Coach's Corner is a education platform for coaches to help bring a university level education to coaching. So to bridge the gap between academia and research, and then how to coach a client in front of you. Really proud of that. It's been a lot of fun to work on, and we're running a 14-day free trial. So sign up, no risk, and see what we're all about. That's it.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely go check him out. He puts out a lot of content on the regular, and he's also got a podcast, which is also called Coach's Corner. Actually, I was listening to one earlier
There
today.
you go.
All right. Thanks so much for jumping on, man.
No problem. Thanks for having me.